It's no secret, tanks that were built in the Soviet Union were much smaller than tanks built in other parts of the world, and that's unfortunately why they were the worst. This wasn't always the case though. In the early stages of the Cold War, the Soviets fielded some really scary stuff. When the IS-3 came out, Western militaries rushed to field better and bigger guns that could deal with them. However, like many perceived wonder weapons from the USSR, the IS-3 was woefully overrated for what it was really capable of on the field. The Soviets did hit home, however, with the T-54, a truly great tank when it came out in 1948, and was well capable of going face to face with the American M48 and British Centurion. The numerical advantage the Soviets would deploy was not with a huge sacrifice to quality. A T-55 engaging an M48 could go either way. When we look back, those M48s were slightly larger in all dimensions compared to the T-55, being longer by 0.3 meters, wider by 0.28 and taller by 0.7. The pattern also outweighed it by around 10 tons. This disparity would indeed continue, as the M60 would stare down the T-72, being taller by over a metre and larger in every metric except for length, while the Chieftain absolutely dwarfed the T-72, with the Leopard also managing this not long after. Then the rest is history. The good old T-72 was produced to the end of the USSR, and was then given witness protection, a new name and address as the T-90A, which is pretty similar in practice. So the scene is set. Western tanks are big, Soviet tanks are small, but why? Are the Westerners just eating too many hamburgers, or are the Soviets just small? Now, in reality, this comes down to a number of pretty simple factors. Firstly, Soviet doctrine, as we all know, pretty much went all in on numerical advantage. As the Germans in the Second World War were faffing around with making the perfect tank with the perfect wheel design and the perfect crew and the perfect tracks, the Soviets realised they could essentially bodge their tanks to last just as long as they were needed, and just, well, make loads of them. Your German tank may look very cool and have a big gun and thick armour, but the logistics behind it are kaput. The transmission is useless, and being able to take out 10 T-34s for every one of your own tanks is all well and good until your own tanks are coming across 11 hostile tanks. You get the idea, and so did the Soviets. Numerical advantage had its place. Being able to make concessions in some areas to just pump out an ungodly amount of tanks worked for them before, and they reckoned it would work for them again. So they kept this idea, and is reflected in the T-55 and T-72. Sure, they weren't the cream of the crop, but they worked, and they could make a lot of them. Perhaps your crew is going to be cramped and suffer battle fatigue. Oh well, what do you care? You only need them to destroy a single enemy tank and support infantry for a while. Why worry about such pointless things when you can field a 2-to-1 numerical advantage? This wasn't all, however. The Soviets began fielding autoloaders, as this small size really did become a bit untenable with tanks such as the T-62 having absolutely abysmal fire rates. And an autoloader, after all, meant that not only can you use the space quite efficiently and thus keep your tank small, you can also reduce the amount of crew in your tank, which means your tank also requires less manpower and training. But these tanks weren't just cramped internally, they were very small height-wise too. So why would this be? That's down to the very well-known perceived war where hordes of Soviet tanks would be cascading over the Iron Curtain into the west on an offensive footing. If your tanks are attacking and not staying dug in, then you really want them to be small, mobile targets that are simply equipped to eliminate what is in front of them. Sure, the gun depression of a T-72 is laughable, but why would you worry about this if you're going to be charging across the plains of Europe against a well-dug-in enemy that's likely holding whatever high ground they can? For the Soviets, a small, cheap tank was up to the task, and while the West was ahead in the late Cold War with optics and computers, the West struggled to convince its democratic populations on spending so much on defence. And therefore all the Soviets needed to do was pump out as much as they could, and they would win the war. They would beat the West, and an eternal communist paradise would rise over the ashes of the decadent West. What's that? What do you mean they're bringing down the wall? Gorbachev did what?